A very healthy 70%. Let's break it down, shall we? Shall we first of all look at the auction results, the published auction results from Saturday, city by city. So Sydney was 69.9%. Melbourne very similar.
Similar, yes. Look, it was a big weekend at the weekend, Sophie, not just for numbers, but also as a test for the market. Now, we've come through the first month of the auction season, so the market's really taken shape now. We'll look at some of those monthly results, but there's no doubt that the Sydney market and the Melbourne market are tracking around about that 70% energy. Numbers of the weekend were around record levels for February Saturday. So it was a test, you know, would the market stand up? And it wasn't just that the numbers were at record levels, they were significantly higher than the weekend before. So it was a real flood of auction activity coming into the market, high numbers, and the market really stayed the same in terms of clearance rates. So that's a very healthy sign, I think, and it does show us where the market is at the moment. A
record Saturday, but not a record month. So why was Saturday such a big one?
Well, I think a lot of it was because it was a weaker previous weekend, just 500 listings in Sydney and a little over 700 in Melbourne. So they were actually quieter weekends the previous weekend. So I think maybe vendors were holding off for the traditional first Super Saturday, as you said, of the season. And the last Saturday in February is typically a strong weekend. The numbers will be lower over the next few weekends.
We do have the numbers from Saturday, actually. We've got the auction listings for Saturday the 24th. So a really big weekend in Melbourne, 1,380.
1,380. Of course, Melbourne is, you know, auction central in terms of the capital city markets. It has a higher proportion of auction activity compared to the other markets. So it wasn't quite as high as the same February Saturday last year, but certainly a lot of properties there under the hammer, and you know, good clearance rate, 70%. And Sydney was very strong, you know, record or at a record level for a February Saturday, so nearly 1,000 auctions. And it wasn't that long ago, Sophie, where the Sydney had never had a 1,000 auction weekend. So to have it in February just shows how auctions are being embraced by Sydney sellers. And again, a good result, 70% clearance rate. Other smaller markets up and down, they also had higher numbers. Brisbane, Adelaide and Canberra had a good challenge out there for sellers competing with other buyers and with other sellers, and you know, clearance rates were quite reasonable for those three smaller markets. So, you know, I think that the big picture is that we've got steady markets, solid results, still in favour of sellers generally, but way below where they were a year ago. And I think that's what we can look at when we sort of examine the February results. And we've got exclusive for Sky, we've got the February
All right,
results.
Let's have a look at those now. The published auction February clearance rate.
Yeah, and of course, no surprise that the numbers are very similar to our weekend clearance rates that we've seen over the past few weekends. And yeah, both almost identical. Sydney and Melbourne have had clearance rates just over 70%. And it's interesting, when we look back a year, we can see just how strong those markets were last February, and that's the whole of February. So we've got more observations here, so it's a much more robust measure of what's happening in the market. But look at the difference between this year and last year in Sydney, 87% clearance rate a year ago in Sydney. I mean, they were just walking out the door properties then. And Melbourne also strong, over 80%. But and a similar results if we look at the smaller markets, they've also come backwards compared to a year ago. So, you know, the interest rate energy has dissipated, and you know, people don't buy houses every day. You know, we've had a lot of pent-up demand that's been released, and I think we're getting much more of a normalised market now. But I still say 7 out of 10 chances of selling your property if you're a seller. You've got to feel pretty good about those odds. And 70% clearance rates are clearly a seller's market. So I think this is a sign for the future. So even though the market is a lot lower or weaker in relative terms to a year ago, I think it's still a healthy market for both buyers and sellers, particularly with higher numbers of properties coming through. It means buyers have got some choice.
And so which year is the anomaly, this year or last year?
Last year was the anomaly, there's no doubt about that. And that's you know, why I'm saying that this year is more of a normalised market. We had extraordinary numbers of listings come in last year. A lot of it was pent-up demand from the higher priced properties in Sydney and pent-up demand from the lower priced properties in Melbourne. They'd been holding back for various reasons, and they sort of let go and caught up with the other parts of the market that had been strong over previous years. So cycles move together, but they move differentially when you sort of go into the sub-market elements. And that's why last year was a real bring forward or a releasing of demand, and I think that was a very strong market, a very atypical market, and so we're easing. But it's interesting that the Melbourne listing numbers this year in February aren't too far away from where they were a year ago. So that Melbourne market, another sign that it's really still operating on 8 cylinders. And the top market in the country. So even though listings are still quite high, it's still getting clearance rate, but not at the same rate as we saw a year ago. So maybe some better news for buyers there, so it's not as competitive.
Yeah, well, now let's look at auction listings for February as a whole, and I think this kind of sums up everything you've just been saying. But
well, I think it's interesting to see that as well as clearance rates are down, those auction listing numbers are also down across the board. And I think that's part of the dissipating the energy coming out of a very, very hot market. I mean, we had a sustained period of lower interest rates, record low interest rates, record low mortgage rates, and it was always going to fuel the market. But these things come to a halt when interest rate changes come to a halt. We had a little bit of differential interest rates last year with higher rates to investors, and we actually had lower rates during the year for owner-occupiers. So that sort of balanced it out a little bit. But that interest rate driver is certainly going to be put to one side, I believe, this year, and we're going to get more of this normalised type of market environment, which we've seen in February. But February has told us now where the market is. I would expect the market to continue to track in Melbourne and Sydney around about that 70% mark. I think that it is certainly lower, still a seller's market. We need to keep an eye on the Adelaide and Canberra market. So Canberra looks like it's sort of run out of puff. Early days, of course, from a very strong year last year. And the Adelaide market's also looking a bit sort of sideways at the moment, but we need more auction activity there to get a clearer insight. But numbers will be lower next weekend, and maybe next week we'll have a look on the show at the top performing suburbs over February, which would be quite interesting to see which suburbs have done the best over the first part of the season.
That'd be great. And auctions don't tell the whole story though, do they?
No, but they're a very good leading indicator, particularly in the Sydney and Melbourne markets, because the proportion of the market, around about 30%, a little bit higher in Melbourne auction sales of total sales, in Sydney about 25%, 25 to 30%, and Canberra similar, and Adelaide about 15%. Now, Brisbane only has around 5% of its market as auction activity, so it's not really a clear indicator or a reliable indicator of underlying activity, but we can really use those auction results to tell us what's happening in the marketplace. And auctions have become more popular, of course, as a marketing tool as prices have risen and demand has moved ahead of supply, because obviously if you've got a lot of competition for your property, it makes sense to put it up to auction to maximise your price outcome. And that's why we've seen particularly Sydney becoming more attached to auction activity.
Well, we look forward to having your suburb by suburb report next week.
We'll be very excited about that.
Thanks so much for your analysis tonight.